Juliet, hi, welcome to How to HR. Welcome to the Facebook group, and it's great to have you here. How are you?
Hi, Kristy-Lee. I'm fine, thank you. Yes, it's a Thursday afternoon in my life and lockdown continues. So it's a strange time, but that's okay. There's still plenty going on in the world.
Tough time for Melbourne, tough time for Victoria at the moment. So we are all thinking of you. I know I've got lots of businesses down there that I know of that some are going okay, some are doing a little tougher. So tough week, a couple of weeks for you guys. So yes. I appreciate you joining us.
We'll get there. Not at all. No, it's great to talk.
Awesome. So I'm excited to have you here today. And for those of you who don't know Juliet, Juliet is a leadership expert. She works with businesses on all aspects of building up their leadership talent pool and working with their teams. But Juliet, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about you and what you do and the sorts of businesses that you help?
Sure, Kristy-Lee. Yeah, so I've been working with leaders and their teams for over 20 years now. And across all sorts of industries. So I've worked with, large banks and finance companies, with airlines and primary producers. I've worked with family farms, not-for-profit. So really across the spectrum, because what I know is that people issues are people issues wherever you go. And leadership is leadership wherever you go. So, and that has really, it means I have seen things across such a broad range of organisations. And can sort of weave those together into different ways. So that's really what I do. I work with leaders and their teams to help them build their leadership skills and their confidence, and to build teams that are working together and communicating together in a way that makes them really effective and high performing.
Awesome, amazing. And today we're talking about, I think, one of the things that I get asked about the most, or that it comes up as a problem most with the businesses I work with, and that is disruptive members of our teams. And I don't know whether you find this, but it's often the tipping point where people will reach out for help or ask for support here in the Facebook group when they've got a disruptive team member that they're not really sure what to do with. Is that the kind of experience you've seen as well?
Totally, absolutely. And it's interesting that we're having this conversation, because this morning, one of the leaders that I'm coaching at the moment raised exactly this. And she is going to have a conversation with this person who's away at the moment, but when they get back on Monday, about their behaviour. And so we mapped out this conversation. And I see it so often. And it is the thing that I think really tests leaders, because this is where the rubber hits the road, in a sense, where you actually have to stand up and lead, and where the team is looking to you for that leadership. Because this person is rocking the boat or upsetting them, or just often just disrupting the status quo sometimes too, and not in a good, productive, let's get some innovation happening way.
Yeah. So if we look at what disruptive behaviour looks like in the workplace then, because I think it shows up in so many different ways. What is disruptive behaviour from a team member? What are we talking about?
Well, I think there's really, as you say, it shows up in a lot of different ways, and some of them are very covert. So it's overt. Sorry. So some of them are really obvious. It's well, I'll rock it at 9:30 when I'm ready, or if I'm working from home, I just won't turn my camera on. I won't even call into the Zoom meetings from time to time. I'm just too busy, or I'm not going to log my tasks into the shared calendar so everyone knows what I'm doing. I'm just going to keep them to myself. So there's things like that, and then there's the really sort of the more disruptive ones, which is the whinging, it's all about them and us, it's all their fault, that sort of behaviour I see a lot too. There's another element to that I see quite often, which is when in an organisation where information is power, withholding information, or giving 3 parts of the information you need, but not the 4th and vital part, and not mentioning that that's the thing you need. So using information as power can be incredibly disruptive as well. So I think
I hadn't even considered that information.
Sorry, you're saying?
Yeah, I hadn't even considered that is super disruptive, and it's almost, I can't even think of the word for it, but it's manipulative, really, isn't it, to purposefully do that?
And passive aggressive in that sort of, I'm pretending I'm helping you, but I'm going to hold back stuff that means you can't do it all, or you can't get the job done. And people know this is happening. It doesn't take long to work out that you're missing the vital piece. So people know that it's happening. And once they know that, again, they're looking to the leader to sort this out, because that's a really tough one for teams to sort out unless you've really built trust in the team.
Yeah, yeah. And is there times when the disruptive behaviour is far less direct and obvious, that perhaps we don't even notice it's happening at the time?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And I think probably this is more common in its hybrid teams now that are coming up, where people are able to be disruptive without even being in the room.
Yes.
So I think there's a whole lot of ways people are disrupting teams at the moment, just because they've settled into their own routine at home, or they've disengaged from the team goals and purpose. And so they're just making the job suit them.
Yeah.
And I think that's incredibly disruptive to the rest of the team. I also see people, virtual teams sometimes at the moment, creating little cliques on the side. So building their little power base on the side with a few people that they're then sharing information that isn't available to the rest of the team.
Yeah, and I think you're right, this hybrid team model, and you and I have spoken about this model a lot recently, it is changing the way that we are working, but it also needs to change the way we lead to an extent too, because we can't rely on the fact that we're going to see what's happening when, 50% plus of our team aren't in the next office or at the cubicle in front of us every day. So if we're not more conscious of building ways into have transparency and to be able to see things, it's far easier for things to go under the radar unnoticed, that we then it can spiral, can't it? So we're dealing with it when it's far worse than what it was in the beginning. And I think it's going to be interesting too when we see these hybrid teams start to come back into a common workplace more, and some organisations are certainly heading down that path now, that people that are resentful about being there, or because they haven't been face to face with each other for an extended period of time, I think that disruptive behaviour has the potential to really flare up when we're being forced back into offices and we're all not happy about it, and all of that's going on as well.
I think that's really true. And what we know is that when we're in the office, if things get annoying, usually people in a team will put their head around the manager's door or whatever, or have a quick chat to them in the kitchen or the lift or whatever, just to say, this is going on. I don't know if you've seen it. I might be overreacting, but here's the thing, those sorts of conversations. But when it's happening virtually, not only is the leader unlikely to see some of it, but picking up the phone to talk about that is a much bigger deal, I think, than it is just putting your head around the door. And I know we've talked about this aspect of hybrid teams and the difficulty for people to raise issues. And I think with a disruptive team member, this is absolutely exacerbated, because that at what point do you decide this person is disrupting things enough for you to pick up the phone and talk to someone? Because that is a more serious thing. That's an interruption in their day. You don't know where they're up to, what they're doing. It seems like a serious complaint in a way.
Absolutely, you're right. If you make that decision to make that contact, it feels like you're making a complaint. Yeah, it's a much more serious thing.
It is, because otherwise, if you're in the office, you just mention it and they would have seen it probably. And so you have that kind of parry that I think is much more difficult with a virtual team.
Yeah. And what are the impacts? Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's also more difficult, and we've talked a little bit about this building trust in a hybrid team, because when you have trust across a team members can call each other on disruptive behaviour. But I think that is also being really challenged at the moment by these hybrid teams, by these sort of people working however they choose to work. And unless leaders are really on top of their team and have a really tight team, I think that ability to confront one another and say, what are you doing? Why would you do that? I think is really difficult.
Yeah. Interesting you say that. I was recording an episode of the podcast recently and I was talking about, above the line and below the line people and behaviour. And one of the things I was suggesting was that if you can work this into be the vocabulary of your business and part of your culture, their peers will start to pull them up on it when they are below the line, and exactly the same here. And it's actually more powerful, I think, sometimes when the peers pull them up on behaviour that's not acceptable or is disruptive or below the line than the manager. Because no one wants to disappoint their like-minded fellow peers where, when the manager's coming down tough on you, you can, these type of people tend to displace it on the manager. But if you can build it in to be part of the culture that you keep each other accountable, I think that's really powerful, but it does require that trust that is so important.
It does, and it also requires trust of the leader. And Patrick Lencioni talks about this, and this idea that if you know that the leader will hold people accountable, then they're much less likely to be required to hold them accountable because you will hold your peers accountable. But if you think the leader is not going to do it, then there's this sense of, well, why would I bother if the leader's not going to bother? Why do I have to put my head on the block? So it's that there has to be that trust of the leader as well, that they would step in and hold the person accountable if they had to.
Yep.
So it's definitely, you're right. And it's interesting when you talk about above and below the line behaviours, you have to have had that conversation first, don't you?
Yes.
Because, and that has to be an ongoing conversation about what do we want our behaviours to be? What are our values? What is the stuff that sits below the line?
What does that look like? That's what it's about. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. How do we want to be working? How do we want to be working with one another? So you've got something to point to, because I think the problem so often is this stuff happens and someone is really disruptive and the team just goes, oh my God, and there's nothing to have that conversation around. They just know this person is not behaving in the right way, but no one's ever had that conversation with the team to say, how do we want to be? What is our culture?
Yeah. Exactly. And you see it show up so often, whether it's a lack of KPIs, a lack of position description, a lack of, a formal way to have these conversations, or there's so many different ways that businesses can weave this into the fabric of their business. So there's no right or wrong. There's just lots of different ways to do it, but you've got to pick a way and just start there, don't you?
I think that's right. And you've just got to do it. You can't wait for a crisis.
No.
The whole thing is you've got to have these conversations before you need to have a difficult conversation.
Yeah.
So that you have this basis that everybody understands and has had a chance to discuss, I think, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we've got a disruptive team member, what are some of the impacts that's going to have on the business? From my perspective, I see it in an engagement sense. We lose engagement and that, has a snowball effect on productivity and profitability. But what are some of the impacts that you see a disruptive team member have in a business?
Yeah, I see frustration, and I think it's interesting. And what I see is when there is a disruptive person, and interestingly, talking to this woman this morning, was a classic example of that. The other team members can see it. The senior team can see it, and everybody's watching to see how it gets dealt with. And in the meantime, they're going, well, why are they allowed to behave like this when I'm not? Why are they not being held to account? Because I feel like I am being held to account. So there's a frustration there. And what I see in teams, and I've come into teams sometimes where they are on the point of, they've got high turnover because nobody's dealing with the disruptive person. And they then get followers because people go, oh, well, that looks like that's kind of fun. And I like that person. They're a bit influential. I'm going to hitch my wagon that way. And so suddenly you get this, increase. The disruption becomes almost the norm. And so all the people who are doing the right thing, they disengage phenomenally.
Yes.
Because it's like, well, I don't want to be part of that. And I'm just trying to do my job. And yet nobody's dealing with this. And I need someone to deal with it. So I see a lot of disengagement, you're right, from that. But I think also what I see is quite often people at the senior levels looking around going, well, who's going to deal with it? Somebody deal with it, and that nobody wants people, I don't know, culturally we're terrible at this stuff, but people don't want to have those conversations because they see it as confrontation.
Mm-hmm.
And we will run a mile to avoid that, you know, we'll do anything
So
we
true.
can. Yeah, so everybody's sort of going, oh, well, okay, maybe you should have the conversation. Well, why don't you get other people in the room with you and then you'll be okay, you know,
Yeah.
instead of saying, actually, I own this, I should have the
Yes.
conversation.
Yeah.
And I do think so often in teams that people disengage because what they're seeing is nobody dealing with it.
Yeah.
And they don't want to have to deal with it, you know, that, and which is fair, they shouldn't have to, you know. It's,
No.
so, and I think frustration is the other thing I see.
Mm.
And a team I was working with last year, because they were all working virtually, what happened was when one person became disruptive, they then formed a little clique. But what that created was other little cliques who were frustrated with the disruption, didn't feel they could deal with it, and trying to have those conversations virtually is a nightmare.
Yeah.
And that didn't feel they could raise it because, you know, that would have required the phone call, and how serious is it, and why do I have to be the person who dobs them in, you know, all of that terribly Australian stuff. So they formed their own clique over here. So what you saw was all these little silos suddenly, because people had created their own little support base. So
yeah, it's that segregation, isn't it? It's not good.
It's awful. And I think it you know, you talk about virtuous spirals where, you know, you start something good and it builds. I think this is exactly that, but in that negative way.
Yeah.
That just drives everybody down to a really lowest common denominator where they're just doing their job and that's about it.
That's it. Yeah,
you know,
they're walking zombies.
Yeah, exactly. And they don't want to be part of the team because the team includes these disruptive elements that no one deals with.
No. So what should leaders be doing? They should obviously be having this conversation, but what's the best thing for a leader to do when they see the disruptive behaviour or when it's brought to their attention?
Yeah. I think you've got to bring it right back to what does it say in the position description? You know, what are your KPIs? What are the behaviours we've all agreed to? Now, if you don't have those in place, you're in all sorts of trouble. You know, and I know you talk about this all the time. These are the fundamentals that we so often avoid doing. But in fact, if you've got them in place, you've got something to talk to.
Yes.
And then I think it's those conversations using that really simple template about when you do this, this is the impact it has. And that matters because of this. And I need you to do this. You know, so really just taking that really simple feedback template and talking it through. So it's not oh, you're an idiot, or, you know, you're driving everyone nuts. You know,
it's really unpacking the impact of that
template.
behaviour.
That's exactly right. Because I think so often people who are disruptive, well, often what I see is they don't have a lot of self-awareness. They're often acting from their own fear and lack of awareness.
Yes.
And when you give them the impact, so often they're like, oh, I had no idea. You know, I wasn't doing it for that reason. I was doing it because of this or whatever, you know. And sometimes they don't even know why they're doing it. They've just sort of fallen into a way of being because no one told them that was the wrong way to be.
Yeah.
So I think there's so much in setting out those original parameters. You know, what is your role and what did you agree to do? And what did we agree to do? And I think sometimes, and I was talking to this woman this morning that I'm coaching, I was saying sometimes you have to actually own it and say, we should have pulled you up on this months ago, but we didn't, you know, and we're conscious we didn't. So we want to get this right now, you know. So actually owning some of it, I think, as a leader as well.
I think that is so important because you're right. We tend to put these conversations off. We run a mile from them. And I think this is an important thing you mentioned too. We see it as confrontation. And I think if we can reframe these conversations, that this is not about confrontation. This is about clarity. It's about communication. It's about setting expectations. It's about listening. It's not about confrontation, because when it's not about confrontation, I think suddenly leaders are more comfortable with the idea of entertaining these conversations. But I think you're so right with what you said, that we also have to own the fact that we should have dealt with this previously and we haven't, because I think that also just brings the energy to a different level where we're both participating in the solution now. And I think the other thing that leaders have to do is you have to go into these meetings with some solution in mind, whether it's clearing up what's expected. But if you don't have a solution, don't expect them to come up with one.
Yeah. And look, ideally you do want them to come up with some part of the solution, but you have to know in your mind what that looks like and what you want out of the conversation. And we talked about this morning. The idea, what do you want by the end of this conversation? You know, do you want this person to have done this or owned this or fixed something? You know, what is the thing?
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that's really important is that it not be a one-off. That you have to say, let's check back in a couple of weeks or whatever it is, or, you know, if it's weekly, or I think a month is too long. I think it has to be enough time for them to shift the behaviour, but not so long that everybody thinks it doesn't actually really matter.
Definitely.
And I think you have to keep coming back until you feel like some kind of level has been restored.
Yeah, I remember hearing, I can't remember who I heard this from. I think it was on a leadership podcast. And they suggested that after having one of these conversations, when you next see the person or speak to the person virtually, whether it's that afternoon or the next day, just checking in with them to say, how are you going? Do you have any follow-up questions? Are there any concerns about what we spoke about? Because often, particularly if they're not self-aware in these meetings, it can be a bit of a shock what you're discussing with them, and perhaps they haven't processed it all in the meeting, and then they go away and process it, but might not feel comfortable to come and say, hey, can I get some clarification? Or I get it and I'll work on it, or I think you're wrong, whatever it is. But sometimes just circling back.
Think about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're right. I think so often it's the first time people have actually had to have that conversation. It's the first time that their behaviour has been challenged. And I know I worked in a couple of organisations where they talked about dressing people up for export. So instead of having the tough conversation because this person was disruptive in the team, they just talked them up to their colleagues and flipped them onto another department. So somebody else got the person. Yeah. And this is the lengths we go to avoid having these conversations.
Yeah.
And I think the thing is the impact on the team of that sort of thing, because we know, and I talk about this a lot, the greatest sport in the world is boss watching. You know, we are always watching our boss to see how they deal with stuff. And if that's the way you deal with stuff, what is the message you send to people?
Yeah, you know, isn't that true?
You know, so I think we need to be really conscious that whatever you think, be really clear that the people in your team are watching you all the time to see how you respond to things.
Yeah.
And if you deal with disruptive behaviour, you create security, you create that psychological safety in the team that says, oh, it's going to be okay because my leader is onto it.
Yes.
And all that stuff we talked about, they're actually holding everybody to it. So I feel safe now. I feel like I know exactly where the boundaries are and I can work within that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas I think if you let somebody go on being disruptive, people just, well, where are the boundaries?
Exactly.
What happened to that?
When people don't know the rules, they make up their own.
Yeah.
It's human nature.
Exactly. Yes.
So, you know, absolutely. So the message to our leaders today is do not avoid the conversations, number one.
Yes.
Make sure you're clear about what the problematic behaviour is or the disruptive behaviour is and how it's impacting other people, how it's affecting the business, how it's impacting their peers, all of the effects that it's having, and what to expect from them in amending this behaviour, whether it's changing what they're doing, whatever it is, be very clear about what your expectation is and follow up, which is key. And I think that's something we're all guilty of not doing enough of. This is not a set and forget. This is a follow-up situation. Would they be the key messages, you think?
I think, look, they certainly are for me. And I think in the middle of that, if you can get them to own the solution by coming up with elements of the solution, then I think that's ideal too, you know, because
Absolutely.
you don't want it to just be a one-way conversation. You want them to be saying what they could do to change the situation. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Engaging them in that is so important.
Mm.
Awesome. Juliet, thank you so much for joining us. That's awesome information. This is a hot topic. I get asked about this,
Yeah.
I think once a week at least. So it's great to
Yeah.
be able to give everyone some guidance from a leadership expert on this topic. And to all of you, be brave, have these conversations, don't delay them, and remember that your team are watching what you're doing. I think that's a great message. But
Good luck.
thank you, Juliet. It's been great to have you, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon.
The pleasure, Kristy-Lee. It's been lovely talking.